Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. And today my guest is Joe Seaby, who is an Alexander Technique teacher. He lives in Burford, Oxfordshire. He also is a resident Alexander Technique teacher at the Oxford School of Drama, and he teaches at the Alexander's studio training course in southwest London. Um, Joe has a long-standing interest in cycling. He even raced for a while, and for many years, cycling has been his primary mode of transportation. And we're going to talk today about how the Alexander technique can be useful for cyclists. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Joe, could you begin by giving our listeners a short description of the Alexander technique?
Sure. Well, these days, if I'm asked, I tend to say it's a very simple means of letting go or removing the obstacles that interfere with your natural functioning, health, and well-being.
Okay, and of course, cycling. I haven't done a lot of cycling in quite a few years, but when I did, one of the things that struck me about it in relation to the Alexander technique was that there is a strong tendency for bicyclists or cyclists to pull their heads back and down on their neck in order to
Absolutely.
see what's in front of them, because typically they're leaning forward from the
Mm.
seat. And for those listeners who are not familiar with it, the Alexander technique puts a lot of emphasis on the head neck upper body relationship. And generally, we're not real keen on people pulling their heads back and down on their neck because that tends to set up a whole uh, train of tension through the body. So I'd like to begin by asking you about that. How do you, when you're working with a cyclist, how do you deal with that issue?
Well, obviously, pulling the head back is a big problem on bicycles because people tend to be quite prone, that is, leaning forwards a long way, and they do feel it's necessary, and it becomes a strong habit to pull their head back, as you say, to see where they're going. And one of the first things I try to show cyclists that it actually is possible to look up and to look forwards without stiffening the neck. So there is the possibility of having the head um, orientated backwards on the neck, so to speak, but without pulling it back and without stiffening the neck. For instance, if you're in the upright, you can look up at the sky or the ceiling without necessarily stiffening your neck.
Right. So it's a distinction between simply moving your head back in order to look forward, but without a kind of a reflexive extra pull, that sort of thing, right? Is
Exactly,
that
without causing a generalized stiffening through the whole body, because as you know, any excess tension anywhere in the body isn't confined to that area. It causes a generalized tightening and stiffening, and that's what we want to avoid. Having said that, a lot of cyclists do tend to be pitched too far forwards on the bicycle. And to give them the best chance of being able to cycle without stiffening their neck, I often make adjustments to their bike to get them into a slightly more upright position.
but I would think that there's a bit of a trade-off between aerodynamics and
Absolutely.
that, because that is why they lean so far forward, right?
Yes, that absolutely. And if you're working with competitive cyclists, then you can't really change their position because they don't want to lose that aerodynamic efficiency. And there's no getting round the fact that wind resistance is the biggest factor in terms of how fast you can go on a bike.
But
So
for people who are bike riding as a means of transportation, particularly in an urban environment, I could see a lot of advantages to being more upright, even
Absolutely.
apart from the head neck thing, because you want to see as much as you can to avoid dangers.
You do. You want to be able to see, and you want other people to see you,
Yes.
and being more upright. Plus, being very prone, being bent forwards, obviously is going to interfere with your breathing as well. So you can um, you can get a lot across to even competitive cyclists. The fact that the one thing they don't want to interfere with is their breathing efficiency. And
Okay. Yeah. Right.
if you can demonstrate to them that stiffening their neck tends to interfere with their breathing as well, then they'll be pretty keen on not stiffening their neck.
hmm So particularly a competitive cycler comes to you for lessons, or even just a regular cyclist, do you tend to work with them on this issue of tilting their head backwards without straining themselves? Do you tend to work with them in your studio first before they get on the bike? How do you approach that?
Normally, I would. When anybody comes to me, I would work with them first off the bike,
hmm
just to get a sense of what's going on in them. But pretty quickly, I'll move onto the bike as well because that's their primary motivation. That's why they've come. But I'll also give them things to practice off the bike um, when they go home, as well as on the bike. So it's a bit of both, really. But certainly, initially, I'll always work off the bike with them and try to give them an experience of being able to tilt the head back on the top of the spine without stiffening the neck, and to show them actually they've got quite a large range of movement with the eyes and the head combined that allows them to look up and forwards without necessarily having to pull back
Hmm.
and stiffen the neck.
I could imagine that having a stationary bike would be a great option to help someone with this too, right?
Yes, I mean I have a stationary
Oh,
bike.
excellent. So you would put them on your stationary bike at some point because it's
Yes.
easier for you to. Obviously, if you want to do hands-on work, it's going to be a lot easier if they're not.
It is. I mean, I live on a farm, so we've got quite a large farmyard, and I can watch them cycle around, and I can run after them. But it's a
Right.
lot. You can't get your hands on them. That's the
It's
thing.
going to be tough, isn't it? Yeah.
It's going to be tough. So yeah, I have a stationary bike which is actually on rollers, and so I can put them on that. The front wheel's supported. Use that on the rollers, and eventually, what we work towards is getting their own bike onto the rollers rather than my specialised one. Get them their own bike onto the rollers, and if we work along enough, they can put their own bike with no other supporting mechanism. So it's a freestanding operation with the bike, and they get a whole sense of balance and everything else on that.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned balance. I would think also that not stiffening your neck while riding a bike would enhance your balance mechanism too, your ability to keep yourself and the bike in balance.
Absolutely, but when normally when they're on the road, those disturbances in balance aren't too apparent to them. But if you put them on a set of rollers, they immediately get an experience of how pulling their head back throws the whole thing off balance because the bike wobbles on the rollers. On the road, they compensate in other ways, of course, by
Right.
stiffening in the legs or the back or wherever.
Right.
Hot.
So when you, particularly, I guess when you're working with a competitive cyclist, there are a whole series of trade-offs here. It's a little more complicated than I originally suggested.
With competitive cyclists, it's a much greater challenge because they don't want changes to their riding position or to the configuration of their bike particularly. What they Their motivation is more power and more speed. So you have to approach them from the point of view of efficiency. If you can talk to them about improved efficiency, so greater power output for less expenditure, then they'll really start to pay attention. But if you start coming at them from the angle that their bike is wrong and that they've got to change their bike, then they're going to switch off straight away. But as soon as you talk about efficiency, their ears prick up and they'll pay attention.
Hmm. And when you're initially working with someone on tilting their head back without strain, do you go into a little body mapping about where exactly your head does move in
Yes,
relation
I
to
mean,
your neck? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if they're a non-Alexander person, as it were, or if they don't have a good idea about exactly how the head relates to the top of the spine, then definitely yes, I'll give them some simple information about that.
Because I mean, in my own teaching experience, I don't remember ever working specifically with a cyclist on their cycling, but most people, I'm sure you found, have very distorted idea of where their head rests on top of their spine, where the movement takes place from, and even things like where the center of gravity of their head is in relation to their spine.
Absolutely, absolutely, and of course the weight of the head and all of
How
that is.
much it weighs, even.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
oh yes, yeah. No, I mean you even get people you might think of as medical professionals who seem to have very little idea about it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they may know the anatomy from a book, but often they have not sort of
Mm.
translated that over to their own bodies. Um, are there excuse me, are there any other issues around working with cyclists, or any other things that are particularly pertinent to cyclists?
Well, I think the main thing that I try to work with, because I don't always have a huge number of lessons with them or a greater amount of time, is I try to focus on the three main areas, which is the head, the hand, well, the 3 points of contact with the bike: the feet, the seat bones, and the hands,
Hmm.
and then the head. So if I can get them thinking about um, those 3 points of contact down the head, I'm definitely winning, and I think I will feel like I've done a pretty good job.
Right. And could you elaborate a little on those first 3 points of contact? What is it that you would tell a cyclist about those three?
Well, in general, seat bones probably are the most important from the Alexander point of view, because they are your main point of contact with the bike. And the the problem with cycling is that because there's so much pushing with the feet, you're always tending to lift the seat bones off the saddle. So getting a cyclist to release their weight through the seat bones and into the saddle away from the head is critical to them being able to get more release in the legs, less stiffening, less contraction, and longer muscle, and therefore more power.
Oh, so I hadn't thought of that. So you're saying that the tendency is going to be to lift off the seat a little bit to
Mm.
get a more powerful push down on the pedals.
Yes, as cyclists push with the pedals and inevitably stiffen in the legs, the tendency is that the seat bones lift off the saddle.
And would you say that what they're getting is, when they do that, they're getting perhaps a feeling that they're putting more pressure on the pedals, but in fact that may not be accurate?
I think undoubtedly, yeah. I think
Hmm.
we know that you can get a very strong feeling that you're exerting more power and being more efficient, but the reality is often the opposite. And as when you can start to get them to have an experience of releasing their weight into the saddle, suddenly the whole experience of what happens in the legs changes, but they also get the experience of not losing any speed or power, and then they're generally convinced.
Hmm. So you have to show them something that's almost measurable, then, right? Like the speed, uh, covering a certain distance in a little bit faster time with that new thought of yours.
I think they have to. they have to get a measurable experience for themselves when they're out cycling, that they're not, losing time or speed or power. That's the main thing. For competitive cyclists, certainly. For less competitive cyclists, what they tend to get is an experience of cycling being more enjoyable,
Hmm.
more comfortable, less stressful, and perhaps less painful as well for some people.
Right. And how about the point of contact of cyclists' hands on the handlebars? What would you tell people about that?
I think the first thing I try to get across is that they don't need to grip too much. Very often they really grip the handlebars, and they often have too much weight on the hands. Again, because they're pitched a long way forwards, so there tends to be too much of their body weight going through the hands. So I see a lot of cyclists who have wrist problems, wrist pain, or pins and needles in the lower arms, numbness in the hands, that sort of thing, and that's primarily to do with too much weight on the hands and too much gripping. So getting them to not grip so much, essentially, to lengthen the fingers rather than wrapping them around the bars.
So that gripping tendency seems to me to be pretty analogous to a car driver's gripping the steering wheel.
Absolutely,
But
yeah,
the added, I would also think that if you rise off the seat of your bike, as you described earlier, then a lot more weight is going to come through your hands onto the handlebar.
certainly some more.
Yeah,
Definitely some more weight. I mean, there are situations where you would naturally come up out off the saddle, cycling uphill, for instance. You'll very often stand on the pedals, and then you'll have to use the handlebars a bit more. But again, all of that can be done without excess gripping and tightening. As you say, it's very like people over gripping and tightening on the steering wheel of the car,
right,
or
right.
holding a book or anything. When people hold anything in their hands, there's a tendency to over grip.
Exactly. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would want to tell cyclists about the Alexander technique and how it might help them?
Um, I think the thing that I always try to get across is that cycling is the ultimate Alexander experience,
How
because
so?
because the pace of it is perfect for you. If you're not taking it too fast, it's perfect pace for you to be able to maintain conscious awareness and control while also being involved in an activity which if it's done well, has very little risk of injury unless you fall off. So it's the perfect, for me anyway, it's the perfect activity to apply all of our Alexander thinking.
And I would think, I mean, for me, it would be walking, but I could see if you were a cyclist, that would be a fantastic opportunity to explore Alexander's ideas.
I agree. I think walking is it's a universal experience.
Hmm.
Walking.
Yeah,
I don't ride a horse. Alexander probably would have said horse riding was the ultimate
he
experience.
would have. Yeah.
Um, I'm not sure he ever rode a bike, but if he had, I think he would have appreciated it, definitely.
Well, I think in general, any activity that you do fairly regularly, and if it's a kind of a repetitive activity like cycling or walking, in my case, swimming also is a wonderful
Yeah,
venue for exploring Alexander's ideas. Any activity like that is a perfect way to perfect framework within which to explore
I agree.
Alexander's ideas. There's not much of a risk of anything bad happening, um, and you have that repetitive aspect to it that really lends itself to experimenting with shifting your thought process and see what happens, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I'm
Yeah.
not a great swimmer, so I'm very biased towards cycling.
I get well,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Well, I think this might be a good, unless there's anything else you want to add, this might be a good place to bring our conversation to a close.
sure. No, I think that's
We,
great.
well, my guest today has been Joe Seaby, who is an Alexander Technique teacher in Burford, Oxfordshire. I always have trouble with that, Oxfordshire. And if he also teaches in London 1 day a week, he teaches in Oxford regularly. If anything that we've been talking about interests you and you live in that area, we'll put a link to Joe's website by the interview. And we'll also put a link to a site where you could find a teacher anywhere else in the world. Joe, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Great pleasure. Thanks very much, Robert.